Good evening. It's good to see this number out. So tonight makes we're going to make a transition. I guess I'll put it that way. So the first 7 lessons are what I would consider kind of foundational lessons. Lesson 8, we somewhat start getting into some of the issues that you'll come across in regards to New Testament authority. Tonight is really a big shift. So the way that we're going to be kind of going through the material is a little bit different than the first 7 lessons for sure. So the first 7 lessons, there's a lot of scripture. Obviously, there's a lot of trying to understand what the Bible tells us. And the next few lessons are going to be, okay, what has man concocted? And how can we refute that based on the lessons that we have previously studied? So if you haven't seen the questions already for Lesson 9, most of the questions are kind of framed in the way, okay, this is the argument that's made, so then how do you respond? And again, the purpose of that is hopefully we can refer back to what we have studied previously to help us with those, having that foundation of New Testament authority. So I just want to kind of put that out there. This is obviously a Bible study, but we're going to be going over some secular history based on the church, based on how some of these things got started. So just to give us a better understanding of the situations in general, and then so we can hopefully better refute them with our knowledge of the Scriptures. So this is your last warning. That sounds so bad. It's your last reminder. Memory verse, 1 Peter 4, verse 11. This is a good one for whenever, now that we've started talking about this in the Missionary Society and the sponsoring church. Whoever speaks is to do so as one who is speaking the utterances of God. Whoever serves is to do as one who is serving by the strength which God supplies, so that in all things God may be glorified through Jesus Christ, to whom belongs the glory and dominion forever and ever. And we'll keep reiterating, authority is the power of one whose will and commands must be obeyed by others. So as I mentioned, there is a shift in kind of the way that we're going to start dealing with the class. And if you think about the church over the last couple hundred years, there really has been, in a great sense, a total lack of respect for New Testament authority. If we can go back, a couple hundred years and look at the divisions, the things that have been concocted by men that have crept into the church, almost all of them we could go back to. Well, there's a lack of authority or lack of respect for authority, and that's one of the reasons why I think that this is such an important topic. It's something that we need to understand. But years ago, back in the 19th century, there was this idea that there's too much denominational division. There's too much religious division. And we need to get back to the roots. We need to get back to the Scriptures. We need to be unified. There were men that recognized there's no unity in what's going on in the religious world. And so we need to get back to what Christ called for and having a unified church. And in light of that, we have the missionary societies that were born. And the purpose in the minds of those that concocted the missionary society, the purpose was to restore the church, restoration of the church through greater evangelism. That's where we're lacking. We really need to be better at evangelizing, and so we need some help. So let's have the missionary society kind of take over this aspect of the church, and we're going to have this restoration through this greater evangelism through the missionary society. And more recently, go ahead, Brother Ken.
When you say restored, you're not referring to the restoration movement, so-called.
So this is restoration, reformation. We're going to talk about that in a little more detail in just a second. Because it's during that time that we see the missionary society really taking hold. But you still had a group of people that were recognizing, okay, we don't really need a separate organization to do the evangelizing. We do need to be better at evangelizing, and we've got a way that we could probably do that. And so we don't want a separate institution to do that, but let's let the church do that. And so they decided, well, it would be a better use of the Lord's money to pull their resources within the church, and then still, hopefully, in their minds, better evangelize or have this greater source of evangelism. And so you have the sponsoring church that was formed. And so with both of these, the question, of course, that we should always go back to whenever we're talking about anything that we practice, anything that we preach, do we have New Testament authority for a middleman in the mission or the work of the church? Can we find a pattern? We've talked about this idea of a pattern that we see within New Testament Scripture for the work of the church. Can we find a pattern for missionary societies or for churches to work through a sponsoring church within the New Testament? And if not, then there's a problem. And so that's what we are going to be talking about in Lesson 9. So Brother Ken talked about the restoration movement. I'll call it the so-called restoration movement. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with at least reading some history in regards to that, some of the names that go along with that. Jim Jonas notes in his book, Modern History of Churches of Christ, he says, the early to mid 1800s was a time of controversy as men like the Campbells, Barton W. Stone, and Walter Scott severed their denominational moorings. It was also a time of exhilarating exploration as they sailed upon the waters of scriptural text alone. It was a time of thrilling discovery as they set foot on the solid ground of biblical teaching concerning the free will of man, the universality of the gospel, the conditional nature of salvation, the organization of the church, and freedom from ecclesiastical tyranny. Above all, it was a time of apprehension, for they did not know what ultimately lay over the horizon. And so we have this, again, this mindset that it wasn't just happening within America, it was happening in other places as well, where with the religious division, people recognizing this is not the way that it should be. We should be unified. And so you had people that were trying to move away from that and go back to the Bible and what the Bible had to say. This is a comment from Curtis Byers on a study of the divisions among brethren. He says, the early restorers' goal for unity was not achieved. Not only did most religious groups refuse to abandon their creeds, but there have been several divisions within the Stone-Campbell movement, or the Restoration movement. Of the many reasons that might be given for these divisions, doctrinal disputes, sectional socio-economic differences, and competing allegiances are probably the three main grounds of the divisions. And we'll talk a little bit about some of these as we move along, because during this time there's a lot going on within our country that causes some issues, even within the so-called Restoration movement. So some of the names that you are probably familiar with, three of the most well-known restorers are Barton W. Stone, Thomas Campbell, and his son Alexander Campbell. And sometimes members of the church will be referred to as Campbellites because of the work of Thomas and Alexander. Thomas Campbell is actually, he's attributed as being the first to preach where the Bible speaks, we speak, and where the Bible is silent, we are silent in 1808. So talking about the division, I'll say, of the church. So this is a chart that I came across. I know it's a little bit small, but this kind of gives us an idea of the differences and divisions that have occurred within the church over the last couple hundred years. And just so you know, just because this is where the chart starts in 1832, that doesn't mean that's where the church starts. So it's just at this time, you've got Barton W. Stone, then you got the Campbells that kind of have their separate groups. They actually come together in what is referred to as the Stone-Campbell movement. And during that time, you have issues like the Missionary Society that come up. You've got churches that are introducing instrumental music and a pastoral system. And so you have a group of people that recognize, no, this is wrong. And then you have a group of people that are saying, no, this is absolutely okay, and we have the authority to do that. So in 1906 is where we actually see within the U.S. Census a split with the churches, and you have an offshoot of the church being the Christian Church of the Disciples of Christ. And so that's kind of what we're talking about tonight, that time. As we move along, we're actually going to start talking about the issues in the 50s and the 60s of institutionalism, and actually the sponsoring churches too that actually come about quite a bit later than the missionary societies. So this is just kind of giving you an idea of divisions that have occurred throughout the years, and like I said, we're really tonight kind of in this area working our way down to the sponsoring church. So when we talk about the missionary society, many had the concept of the universal church being composed of local congregations, which we talked about that when we talked about the church, ecclesia, the difference in the universal church and the local church. And what was the universal church? Right. The church as individuals, all of us are comprised of the universal, or all of us comprise the universal church. Christians that are in China and Christians that are in Africa, but it's not the local congregations that make up the universal church. So very early on, Alexander Campbell was a proponent of this idea of pooling our resources of various churches in order to support preachers throughout the world. And it's kind of interesting because, and we're going to read some of his comments, some of his writings, he was very adamantly opposed to it for the right reasons, but then we see gradually, not only is he okay with it, but he actually becomes the president of the American Christian Missionary Society. And one of the reasons why I want us to see this is to recognize how critical and important it is for us, because here you've got a guy that from his writings, again, that we'll read, he's founded in the truth and recognizing this is not acceptable. And then over time, he starts moving toward the error, so much so that I think until his death, he was actually the president of the American Christian Missionary Society. And one thing that you'll see as we talk about these different issues that we're really running through was the desire to organize the church, or the lack of the confidence in the church to be able to do what it was organized to do, to be able to do the work that it had been given to do. So again, talking about this early time period, this again is from Curtis Byers. It says, the religious world at the time of the early restorers was accustomed to a wide variety of ecclesiastical organizations, conventions, synods, conferences, councils, etc. The restorers argued strongly against such governing bodies, and it was their conflict with such bodies that gave impetus to their restoring efforts. The restorers were equally distrustful of the various non-governing organizations created by the denominations to accomplish a specific work. For example, the Missionary Society and the Bible Society. And so, again, this is kind of their background, where within the Baptist Church, the Methodist Church, wherever, they have these different conventions where they make decisions on what they're going to believe, and they recognize, okay, well, this isn't the way that it should be. Obviously, we should believe what the Bible has to say and let that be it. So, again, I talked about Alexander Campbell in his early years, that he argued very forcefully against non-church organizations. And this is his first article in his opening issue. He had a bulletin. It was called the Christian Baptist. And this is what he writes in there in his very first one, Volume 1, Number 1, in 1823. Their churches were not fractured into missionary societies, Bible societies, education societies, nor did they dream of organizing such in the world. They knew nothing of the hobbies of modern times. In their church capacity alone they moved. They dare not transfer to a missionary society or a Bible society or education society a cent or a prayer, lest in so doing they should rob the church of its glory. He continues, this is in 1823, in Volume 1, Number 5. He says, and this is in answering a question that had been presented to him, he says, with regard to Bible societies, they are the most specious and plausible of all the institutions of this age. No man who loves the Bible can refrain from rejoicing at its increasing circulation. But and let me just point out, so the Bible societies were groups of people where they would actually distribute Bibles. And so it wasn't the missionary society as we think of as far as to better evangelize. They were actually giving out Bibles. He says, "No man who loves the Bible can refrain from rejoicing at its increasing circulation, but every Christian who understands the nature and design, the excellence and the glory of the institution called the Church of Jesus Christ, will lament to see its glory transferred to a human corporation. The church is robbed of its character by every institution, merely human, that would ape its excellence and substitute itself in its place. Let every Church of Christ, then, if it can only disseminate 20 Bibles or 20 Testaments in 1 year, do this much. Then it will know into what channel its bounty flows. It will need no recording secretary, no president, no managers of its bounty. It will send all the pageantry this religious shows to the religions of pride and vanity whence they came. And the church and its king will have all the glory." So he's actually writing some pretty good stuff to refute what's being presented. And again, this is in 1823. So this is now the argument that he makes. This is in 1831. So they were just 7, 8 years down the road. He says, "God has given no particular organization in which and through which churches of Christ may pool their resources and cooperate for the accomplishment of that which is the responsibility of not one, but all the churches. Therefore, churches of Christ may form an organization for this purpose that meets the particular needs of the age. Hence, the missionary society is scriptural." Let me read that again. "God has given no particular organization in which and through which churches of Christ may pool their resources and cooperate for the accomplishment of that which is the responsibility of not one, but all the churches. Therefore, churches of Christ may form an organization for this purpose that meets the particular needs of the age. Hence, the missionary society is scriptural." So I will just ask the question, what's the problem with this argument? All right.
He starts out by saying, God has not given us an organization.
Okay.
We're set up one anyway.
Yeah. Go ahead, Sam. Yeah. Miss Shirley, I had heard you saying something. Yeah, God has given no particular organization so that the churches can pool their resources, which the church is the organization. Obviously, he's come a long way in 8 years in the opposite direction. But God has given us the organization, the church, and the church is the pillar and support of the truth, and it's not anything else. And so God has provided everything that we need to be able to fulfill, again, the things that He has asked us to do. Jesse, did you have something? Oh, I thought I saw your... All right, so this is a little bit later on in 1849 now. A group of people were getting together for a convention, and this was held in Cincinnati, Ohio, and this is where you actually have the birth of the American Christian Missionary Society, and I think I had read somewhere like 150 different churches were a part of this. Alexander Campbell, it is said, was not here because of sickness, but I'll just read you as far as what the purpose that it was said to be. And this is Earl West talking in Search for the Ancient Order. He says, "We met not for the purpose of enacting ecclesiastical laws, not to interfere with the true and scriptural independence of the churches, but to consult about the best ways for giving efficiency to our power, and to devise such," that's a bad word, "and to devise such methods of cooperation in the great work of converting and sanctifying the world, as our combined counsels under the guidance of providence might suggest and approve. There are some duties of the church which a single congregation cannot, by her unaided strength, discharge. A primary object being to devise some scheme for a more effectual proclamation of the gospel in destitute places, both at home and abroad, the convention took under consideration the organization of a missionary society. I guess I could ask what's wrong with that. There's so much going on there. And this is what we end up with. So we end up with the churches that are now providing their resources to a separate institution to then allow that separate institution, the missionary society, to do the evangelizing. And I don't remember, I think I mentioned it previously, but Alexander Campbell ended up being voted as the president, even though he wasn't there. That was in 1849. I think he died in 1866, and he was the president of the Missionary Society up until that point. So you've got a group of people that have come together in their mind to unify, and it ends up causing really more division. So in the latter half of the 1800s, the debate around these things was really getting heated. And well, what happens in the latter half of the 1800s? Well, you have the Civil War. And so you've got diversity that is automatically created because of what's going on within our country. So you've got these northern churches that they were, in that day and time, they were wealthier. And they had a lot more of the ecumenical influence than churches in the South. The churches that were in the North, they had a lot more emphasis that they were placing on modern and really opulent buildings, church buildings, whereas you didn't have so in the South. You've got college-educated people that were doing a lot of the preaching up north, and something that they were calling for. You didn't have these just rough-cut country boys that were getting up and preaching like they had in the South. And with these various differences, you've got people that are starting to introduce mechanical instruments of music into the worship as well. Go ahead, Brother Ken.
You used a word that I'd like you to define. I work with you a lot. What does ecumenicate?
I'm going to give you the proper definition instead of me. I actually had it pulled up because it is a big word that yeah, I mean, it really is the idea, because it's not pulling up, it's really the idea of groups, different groups getting together and being okay with one another. And the exact opposite of what we see. It didn't really matter what you believe, it didn't really matter what I believe. Let's all just be together. So that's kind of what you see going on, more so in this day and time, more so up north than you had going on in the South. Sam? So say what you said at the beginning again. So,
I think generally the definition of ecumenical is just to look into unity of churches. What
yep.
that encompasses what you were saying. Is that a connotation that's been taken as of recent? What you're saying about it?
So you're asking, is this being defined this way just recently? I'd have to go back and do some research. I don't know what or when the ecumenical idea kind of originated, and so I'll have to get.
Whoever the popular pope at the time was, kind of pushed this.
I'll make a note and we'll do us a little ecumenical study. Yeah.
The definition of promoting or related to unity among the world's Christian churches. Quote, Christian churches. Anybody that believes in Christ for the first somehow.
So in 1849 is when the American Missionary Society was formed, and so this is also from Curtis Byers. He says in 1863, the American Christian Missionary Society passed even a stronger resolution in favor of the North, and so again, 1863. Think about the time, and again the situation of the country. And so you've actually got people within the Missionary Society that are starting to argue within themselves. And so they passed this even stronger resolution in favor of the North. The ACMS passed these to assure that it had no disloyalty to the Union, but the effect was to alienate the churches in the South. For example, after the war was over, Fanning called for a general consultation meeting of Southern Christians, which was held in Murfreesboro in June 1866. This was objected to by the Northern Christians, such as Benjamin Franklin. This sectional division in the churches was only to become more pronounced, so that by the time the formal division between the churches of Christ and the disciples of Christ, Christian churches, was acknowledged in 1906, the Southern churches were primarily churches of Christ, and Northern churches, disciples of Christ or Christian churches. And so again, we see this restoration movement, again, what is continuing to happen because nobody is, or a large part of them aren't standing on the truth. And so we see when error creeps into the church, then this is what happens. So I'm going to read you just a couple, I shouldn't say a couple, there's a few comments that I have during this time to kind of give you an idea of the different mindsets of the time. So this is in 1885, what I would consider probably a conservative thought. He says, and this is James Thornberry, he says, the only way to sustain Christianity and have union is for all of us to say and believe that all God's statements are facts and truths, and that all His commandments are to be obeyed literally. So, again, we got to base it all on what God says. That's where it should be at. Well, then you've got somebody like M.M. Good. This is in 1886. He says, the Bible contains but few specific details, but it does contain every principle of action the human family will ever need. It assumes the common sense of the race. In regard to the methods employed for preaching the gospel to the world and all benevolent administrations of the church, Christians have no positive specifications, and they must be governed by general laws and principles applied according to their best judgment. So, well, we got some of what we need, but some of it we're just going to have to decide for ourselves and just use our best judgment. Well, then you've got George T. Smith, 1893, says a principle may set aside an apostolic precept. It may brush aside an apostolic decree. We do that constantly. We follow the apostolic example whenever we like it. When we do not, we depart from it. And this is in 1893. That could have been in 1993. Could have been in 2003, 2000. This is so much of the mindset of people, some of them even within the church. Well, we do a lot of things without authority. Well, then stop. Don't. Just because we've always done something a certain way is not then authority to continue doing it that way. Well, we've always done it that way. Well, we don't always listen to apostolic examples. We just do that whenever we want to. And then when we don't have to. No. So writing about the signs and times in 1897, Daniel Summer wrote, he says, as time advanced, such of those churches as assembled in large towns and cities gradually became proud, or at least sufficiently worldly, minded in desire to desire popularity, and in order to attain that unscriptural end, they adopted certain popular arrangements, such as the hired pastor, the church choir, instrumental music, man-made societies to advance the gospel. In so doing, they divided the brotherhood of disciples. And that's exactly what was going on. Also in 1897, H.C. Alman, he said, "We have enough cheap churches. We may be a great church. We may never be, however, with dwarfed preachers and insignificant preachers." And so, I'm sorry, we got to get rid of Jesse. You know, Jesse is just not, he's not really what we need to be able to, just look at him. And so we need very well-educated preachers, and we need, that's what's going on here. And it's all about the perception of the man. Well, if he was trained, at this particular school, then man, we can, announce that. And who cares how they preach if they preach the word? A.M. Hall in 1895, he says, "There is a call today for more educated men in the pew, more thoroughly trained preachers, more profound thinkers, more cultural liberal editors, and more scholarly professors." And it's just like I read this stuff and I think about Jesus talking to the scribes and the Pharisees, and it's like, man, they got it backwards. They got it all wrong. And it created such a huge division. So we talked a little bit about this with the division that really took place in 1906. Again, leading up to that, you can see the introduction of the Missionary Society. You can see the differences that just happened to come about because of the Civil War. And so you've really got a huge difference that has been created, but the biggest difference is the fact that you've got men that are going to stand on the truth and recognize there's no place in the church. We don't need the Missionary Society. There's no authority for instrumental music. There's no authority for these things. And then you've got this other group of people that have decided that no, there actually is. And so I'd mentioned previously in 1906 in the U.S. Census is actually where you see the first distinction given between churches of Christ and the Christian church or the disciples of Christ. And if you remember, it's either in Lesson 1 or Lesson 2, we talked about Floyd Decker. We talked about another gentleman, I can't remember his name, and they were given reasons why they left the Christian church, and all of the things that they listed, all of the error that those churches were involved with. We talked about it in regards to, is this really important for us today? Because, these men were talking about this 100 years ago. But everything that you could read that the Christian churches were involved with at that time, and the reason that they were leaving them, every one of those things are things that people that call themselves the Lord's church are involved with today and have been for some time. And division obviously was extremely apparent at this time, so much so that you've got, again, it showing there in the U.S. Census. And the primary opposition at the time was really twofold: the missionary societies and the use of instrumental music in worship services. And then you've got other organizations that have really taken up the call to do the Lord's work. This is one, the World Christian Broadcasting Corporation, and you can go to their website. And in a letter that was dated April of 1980, the then president of the World Christian Broadcasting Corporation, B.E. Davis, he quoted Matthew 28:19 and mentioned the number of souls in the world today in need of the gospel. He then stated the World Christian Broadcasting Corporation has been devised as a way to overcome this obstacle. You read some of this stuff, and it's just like, how can people walk away thinking that we have devised something better than God? And it really is sad that men have been so prideful and so ashamed of God and His wisdom and what He has organized that they think that we need something better. That God has placed an obstacle in front of us that we then have to, God expects us to come up with something else to be able to overcome this obstacle. It's really, really sad. So you've got the Missionary Society, you've got people that are arguing, okay, this is not scriptural, we can't find authority for this, and we don't need to take this work away from the church. This is the work that the church has been given to do. But they still felt like, okay, but we're not really doing enough. We're not really evangelizing like we should. So but we still need to try to keep it within the church, or the church is, because the missionary societies are wrong. And so they basically started doing the exact same thing. They just took out the missionary society and put in place a sponsoring church. And during this time, so this is, about 100 years later, if you think about the time during World War II, and I shouldn't say think about the time, but maybe if you've read about the time, maybe a few here that was around during that time. But when our men were coming home from war, they were recognizing that, okay, we've got a world full of lost sinners, and we really need to do something about it. And so they bring back this idea of we have to be better at evangelizing the world. We have to do what we can to save the world from their sins. And so at this time, the thought was, well, independent congregations, that they could work together with their resources and to more effectively, again, in their mind, evangelize. And so, again, this is the same concept as you've got with the missionary society. It's just set up a little bit differently. And this missionary spirit that you read about during this time is because they had this idea, again, we got to do what we can to evangelize the world, or better evangelize the world. And so you've got churches that are going to then send all of their resources to one church, and that church is then going to provide oversight for all of those funds to then evangelize. And one of the first things that we see is the Broadway Church in Lubbock, Texas. They were interested in reaching out to Germany, and what can we do to better evangelize Germany? And so they sent word to all the churches and said, hey, give us some money, send us your money, and the elders of the Broadway Church are going to oversee the evangelizing of Germany. And so they actually sent a gentleman by the name of Otis Gatewood to Germany and to do the preaching there. And so you've got this evangelizing of Germany that's done through these congregations, sending all of their funds to the Broadway Church. And so then the Broadway Church, or the Broadway elders, are overseeing that work that's going on in Germany. Well, about the same time, you've got the Union Avenue congregation in Memphis okay, well, guys in Lubbock, they've got Germany. We're going to take Japan. So let's see what we can do about evangelizing, or better evangelizing, Japan. And so you've got this situation where you've got one eldership of the Union Avenue Church that's overseeing the work of multiple congregations to see that Japan is evangelized. Well, there's some thought that, well, this is really, really going well in these other countries, so what can we do better in our own country? And so you've got the formation of the Herald of Truth, which was started in 1947. And eventually the Highland Church in Abilene, Texas, took over control of the Herald of Truth. And so you've got various congregations that are sending their money to the Highland Church, who then is overseeing the Herald of Truth, who is then going to try and better evangelize. And this is a comment in regards to the Herald of Truth. It says, in the case of the Herald of Truth, approximately 4,500 churches around the United States are sending funds to the 5th and Highland Streets Church of Christ in Abilene, Texas, which in turn is overseeing several brotherhood works, among them the production of the Herald of Truth radio and television broadcast, the Heartbeat broadcast on the National Broadcast Company network of radio stations, and Restoration, a monthly magazine published in connection with the Herald of Truth. So this is, again, same idea, just within the United States, and this is actually from the Herald of Truth website, and this is what they list as their strategy: reaching out to individuals through media, the internet, and events, doing what the local church can't. Oh, wow. Like, how can you, I don't even know how you can write that out and think, man, this is good. We're doing something that, we're doing something that God just was not able to do. Jesus was not able to do with the church that he established, but we're able to do it. Our goal is to lead the lost to Christ, disciple and integrate new believers in the local church. Well, right here in our own backyard, we've got the Sycamore Church that thinks, you know what, we're about to really evangelize the world. So they had sent information to all the churches and said, give us your money. We've got this great idea that we're going to be able to evangelize. We're going to start with the United States, and then once we get that done, we're going to go to Canada. We're going to go to the islands next, and so we need like $17 million. $17 million is our goal. We're going to be able to put this together, and we'll all be this one nation under God. Well, they were not getting even anywhere close to the $17 million, and so a little bit later on, they said, you know what, we can do the same work with only $10 million. So let's just get to $10 million, we'll do this work. This is from their website. One Nation Under God is an evangelistic project under the oversight of the elders of the Sycamore Church of Christ in Cookeville, Tennessee. By means of direct mail, the gospel is made known to population groups in various countries. So, again, same setup. You've got various churches that are going to send their money to the Sycamore Church here in Cookeville, and they're going to oversee this work, One Nation Under God, to better evangelize the world. And this is where we're going to start with. So you got all this information now, all this stuff that's kind of gone on since the middle part of the 19th century. Do we have New Testament authority for the Missionary Society or the sponsoring church? So we'll pick up there next week. Thanks, everybody.